As an invested partner to the swine industry and the people behind it, Merck Animal Health is dedicated to supporting you and the well-being of your operation now and in the future, working right alongside you to help address your challenges. Our prevention-centric focus provides greater possibilities for profitability through healthier pigs, improved animal welfare, and unrivaled support in a quickly evolving marketplace. Merck Animal Health, driven by prevention.
Our next plenary speaker is Dr. Hyatt Frobose. Dr. Frobose serves as the USA Commercial Director and Nutritionist for Gestal, a Quebec-based company. Hyatt specializes in assisting swine producers with group housing solutions and nutritional programs to optimize performance and welfare of sows and growing pigs in commercial environments. Hyatt has assisted with the design of over 150 sow farms representing over 300,000 sows. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Frobose.
Thank you, Stacy. Can you guys hear me all right? Well, I appreciate you having me today and welcome the opportunity. I'm definitely in rarefied air with some of the other speakers in the lineup and humbled to have the opportunity to give you guys some perspective on a hot topic that is California Prop 12. And well, I'll cover a broad area today, but I definitely want to emphasize that with regard to California Prop 12 and group housing, I think we're all still learning, myself included. And I've been fortunate enough to be in the crosshairs of that a lot with my day job, but I can hopefully impart some experience that I've had throughout the group housing experience for you guys today. I feel a little overdressed compared to Dr. Frecking and our previous speakers, but after sitting behind a webinar for the past year and a half on COVID, it's kind of nice to be able to wear dress pants and dress up a little bit. So I figured I'd take advantage of the opportunity. Those of you that haven't spent a lot of time understanding what Prop 12 is, if you're in the pork industry, you might be living under a rock because I think you've been getting blasted by news articles and webcasts and webinars and such, some of which that I've had the opportunity to participate in. But I want to give a quick background on what it entails from a legal standpoint. I'll start by saying I'm not a lawyer, and so I can't comment on some of the things that maybe you guys have very important questions on. But it's important to understand that Prop 12 applies to breeding pigs, laying hens, and veal calves. It passed by voter referendum in 2018 and is currently slated to go into effect January 1 of 2022 for breeding pigs. It's important to note that this impacts all pork sold in California, not just pork raised in California, which is part of the reason we're having this conversation today, because most of our pork is raised outside of the state of California. Our industry has made very valiant attempts to overturn this legislation for the past couple of years, using the Dormant Commerce Clause as one of the justifications. Thus far, those attempts have been ineffective. As a result, we're heading that direction in some way, shape, or form, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. We are expecting a federal appeals court ruling by midsummer, which will hopefully give some of you in the audience a little better pulse on what the trajectory looks like for Prop 12. And the California Department of Food and Agriculture only recently released the proposed text for the implementation of Proposition 12. I would highly recommend you go to the California Department of Ag website. They do have the ability to sign up for an email blast if any new information comes available, and you can have fun reading the 200 pages that they just released a couple weeks ago, like I have, trying to read through the legal jargon that all entails. But there is some good nuggets to take out of that, especially if you're one that's impacted by this specifically. As far as the important details from a pork side, what is Prop 12? It applies to any female pig destined for breeding purposes, which may be an important clause, 6 months of age or older. Each sow or breeding gilt 24 months or 6 months or older must have at least 24 square feet of usable floor space. And sows must be able to turn around freely without touching the sides of their enclosure. Ipso facto, gestation stalls as we know it are A, too small, and B, don't let the sow turn around freely without touching the sides. So we've got something on our table right there. Now, the exemptions for Prop 12 are pretty important, and as far as implementation, we need to think about these. Exemptions I highlighted that are the most impactful as we talk building design during individual treatment. So sows that are lame, thin, sick, those animals could be exempt from having to apply the 24 square foot or no stall enclosure rule. They're exempt if they're 5 days prior to their expected farrowing date, while nursing or lactating piglets, and for temporary animal husbandry purposes. That means the max of 6 hours per day. Let's use AIing or breeding, heat checking as an example, ultrasounding sows, but a maximum of 24 hours in a 30-day window. I'm not envious of whoever's in charge of handling compliance on that one, of how you track the records of whether she spent more than 24 hours and 30 days in a stall when she was enclosed, but this is the way the legal writing is as of today. You might see my asterisk at the bottom that this applies specifically to whole pork meat, but not to ground product. So combination products like soups, sandwiches, hot dogs, pizzas, those pork products are exempt from Prop 12. So particularly whole pork meat, fresh pork meat, cured pork meat is going to be impacted the most. So this is a snapshot from the CDFA website where they recently released these regulations. So any of you that want to dig deeper on some of this and learn more than what I can tell you in the short period I have with you, go to this website. You can click on these links and get your fill of lots of legal text on this. These were just released May 28th, I believe. We do have an open comment period on this till July 12th, so anybody that wants to submit comments from the industry can do so leading up to July 12th. And some of the legal opinions that I've talked to have encouraged myself and others to go ahead and do that to help with this rollout of Prop 12 if and when it happens. So what does this mean for the US? We got 40 million people in California today, and that's part of the reason why we can't ignore this wholesale. They represent 12% of the US population, and there's also a significant demographic in those states of Hispanics and Asian Americans who are historically large pork eaters. So from a total pork intake footprint, they represent about 15% of domestic consumption. Yet, there's only about 9,000 sows in the state of California producing pigs, which represents only about 0.1% of our breeding herd. Estimates from Rabobank and some other experts would say that only about 4% of US farms, I should say, were compliant. This was maybe as of several months ago. We have several farms that have recently become compliant or tentatively compliant. However, one thing that's important to remember is some of these farms that represent that 4% pre-existing are already going to some other destinations. We have niche products, high animal welfare marketing streams that are already being utilized by other packers in other states, other regions of the country. And so those 4% aren't necessarily going to get shunted immediately to the California market. However, they would technically fit these compliance regulations. So the result of the impact of California Prop 12 being rolled out January 1st is likely to cause a shortfall in compliant pork going into the state of California. So we have a lot of producers who are looking at the cost of conversion or expansion in order to be able to meet these regulations and provide hopefully a value-added product to California after Prop 12 is implemented. I want to quickly say, first of all, I know I work for a group housing company, so I've gotten put in the crosshairs on this a lot, but I am not an advocate of Prop 12, and I don't want to mistake that for anybody. The state of California, in their own economic analysis, admits that this is going to have a negative economic impact on producers and a negative economic impact on consumers in the state of California. They admit that the regulations, at least from a pig and veal standpoint, are not based on peer-reviewed science. Dr. Frecking, I think, talked about pulling the 6-foot spacing out of their anus from the government standpoint. 24 square foot, I wouldn't say it's quite that far. The Europeans put in place a 24 square foot regulation for the EU several years ago. But in general, there's very little to no peer-reviewed science that would say gestating sows need 24 square feet to be high animal welfare and able to produce at a high level. So that number was a little bit grabbed out of thin air for us to choke on a little bit. Obviously, our pork producers outside of the state of California are forced to incur these renovation costs and or add new construction, which is particularly expensive in this environment, in order to comply. Not to mention the cost of incurring those compliance audits and certification costs. One of the things that I'm afraid of long-term is that whether Prop 12 takes hold as it is, these costs are, unfortunately, in my opinion, likely to result in additional industry consolidation. And I don't necessarily think that's a good thing for the industry long-term. So from a current industry reaction standpoint, this is where I can get into stuff that I see from my vantage point a little bit better as a nutritionist and as a building designer. We have the National Pork Producers Council and AFBF lawsuit, which is currently being reviewed by the appeals court, and a resolution is expected by midsummer, which will probably either speed up or slow down the transition that we're seeing right now. But since the middle of last year, I can tell you what's come across my desk is I've gotten asked to either review or provide layouts for about 445,000 sows worth of Prop 12 designs. So I went back in all my files and counted that up prior to this talk, because I thought that would be a number that might hit you guys a little bit to say, how many people are really thinking about this? There was a lot of those that were evaluated but chose not to do it. But I confirmed that over 50% of those 445,000 sows that I had the chance to work with are in varying stages of completion of adapting to Prop 12. Over 40% of the Pork Powerhouse list is represented in those groups that I had the opportunity to work with. So, and especially all of the ones who have packer ownership in a vertically integrated fashion have pursued this at some varying degree of progress. Now, obviously, I'm just one supplier with Gestall. I'm not seeing everybody, because there's lots of different ways to become Prop 12 compliant. So certainly, if I'm seeing 445,000 sows in a year, I think there's probably a certain X number above that that is also looking at or going Prop 12 using other management strategies too. So that might give you guys a little bit of perspective in the audience of how serious this is. But if you backtrack a little bit and go back to the 40 million people, 15% of US intake, we need roughly 900,000 sows at current production levels to be able to fit that pork market if we're going to maintain the same level of pork going to that market. So, 250,000 sows is a drop in the bucket in the overall transition. So let me step back a little bit for those of you that haven't spent a lot of time in sow barns or don't have perspective on group housing and what different square footages look like. I've always found this is helpful for people, but this is one of the tighter square footages I've come across in my young career. This was 15 square foot in a stanchion darn. Here's what a pen looked like with 19.25 square foot, 19.5 square foot. Both of those numbers are pretty reasonable that I would see commonly in industry barns today before Prop 12. Here's an example of what 21.5 square foot looks like in a stanchion barn when sows are eating. Here's a Prop 12 compliant barn at 24 square foot. Lots of room. Each of these sows they got their own little vacation home in different corners of the pen, right? So, from that standpoint, there's a lot of working space for those girls to move around. If I was writing the checks for the building, I would be questioning whether that's very utilized space. But for Prop 12 compliance, that's something that we need to look at. Now, those are gilts, so sows will take up a little bigger footprint in the picture, but I think that gives you guys a little bit of a perspective. And some barns today, for some of these advanced animal welfare programs, are as high as 32 square foot. So you can see what that looks like, and who knows what 2030 or 2040 might look like as well. So how do I become compliant? So if you're a producer or have decision-making role in farms that are maybe trying to fit this California market, I just picked a 2,800 sow layout that was easy enough for us to look at here. But the top building is gestation, the middle building is farrowing, and the bottom is gilt development, all connected. So if I'm trying to go Prop 12, my gestation barn, I've got to convert from roughly 14 square foot per sow, 24 inch wide by 7 foot deep stall in most cases, to 24 square feet. Farrowing, as of right now, I don't have to change anything. But if I've got metal that's wearing out, or my crates are 5x7s and I'm trying to make them wider to be able to maybe cut down on pre-weaning mortality, or I have some opportunities to change wean age, some things I might want to be thinking about in farrowing anyways. Finally, gilt development, definitely a big X factor. If we have gilt development today, but we're trying to go Prop 12, does that gilt development space become something that we use for additional gestation? Or do we change our gilt development strategy to where we have to bring in select gilts so that we can accomplish the 24 square foot requirement? The last stage or 2 stages, let's say 6 weeks of most GDUs, are 24-week-old gilts or older. So technically, from a Prop 12 standpoint, they require 24 square feet. I have not personally been on any GDUs that have 24 square feet anytime recently. Most of the time we're in the 12 square feet if we can get it. A lot of times we're tighter than that because of space. So having to carve out 24 square feet for your gestating gilts or your unbred gilts is also adding to the mix here, right? So One of the questions that I've gotten asked several times is, for those of you that maybe aren't sow people, isn't group housing already normal in a lot of farms? Can't we be pretty close to Prop 12? Well, a lot of people, especially those that aren't in the pork industry, don't always understand that today's group housing, for the most part, is moving sows post-preg check, 35 to 42 days, into pens, and usually at square footages that would be somewhere between 16 and 20 square feet is what I typically see as the most common averages. So when I look at a barn like this 2800, here's the stall farm today with some gilt pens at the top. If I was asked to convert this to traditional pen gestation post-preg check, I'd keep half the stalls, basically keep the gilt pens, and convert the bottom half to gestating sow pens for the last 10 weeks or so of gestation. And I'd probably do that at somewhere around 18 to 19 square foot without losing any spaces in that barn. Part of the reason that it's been somewhat acceptable or palatable for producers is that we can maintain the certain amount of inventory we had with stalls by cannibalizing alleyways that we have in front of and behind sows to use that as group space. So in many cases with group housing, we're looking something like this, which is way different than when we become Prop 12 compliant. So I had 2,724 spaces in an all-stall barn. To become Prop 12 compliant, and this is probably like best case scenario, tucking as many spaces in here and minimizing alleys as much as I can in my design, I'm losing almost 700 spaces. So best case scenario, we're losing 20 to 30% of our spaces in our G barn to accomplish California's requirements. That's a big deal, especially when we have all this farrowing space that's even more expensive than our gestation space, that we're trying to get the most value out of that. If I'm weaning an 18-day-old pig and I can maybe extend wean age, that's a little bit different. But I've got a certain amount of expectations for pigs going out the door. And if I've just cut my legs out from underneath me in gestation, I've got to figure out what I can do. That's where I get brought into the equation. What do we do? So a very common option has been conversion. All right, so I've got an existing facility. Maybe it's an aged facility with worn out metal. I need to do something this year anyways. I'm going to decrease inventory rather than expanding onto this barn, so no new brick and mortar. In this situation, we have to stomach the fact that we're losing some gestation spaces in our footprint for the G barn. We now have excess farrowing space. So as I alluded, we got some options there. We can use some farrowing for gestation because we're long on farrowing. I can extend wean age. Do I have a GDU? Can I convert the GDU to gestation and maybe get back to the right approximate number of gestation spaces? In so doing, I'm also totally changing my gilt development program where I'm developing gilts off-site, which you can do, but has some challenges as well. Can we breed those gilts off-site? Can we gestate those gilts off-site? You know, one of the big things that I would tell you is that every farm that I've had the opportunity to help give some guidance on Prop 12 conversions, I got to look at with a different set of eyes because every farm has some different factors that we need to work around, and it's a big optimization problem for those of you that like that critical thinking. The other option, and a very popular option as well, is let's expand gestation to get back to the right number of gestation spaces so that we can fully utilize our farrowing and potentially our GDU that's already in existence. Farrowing. I already talked about this a little bit, but today, farrowing is not impacted by Prop 12. It was excluded from the Prop 12 text, and probably strategically so by those who were writing it, because they knew that we have a little stronger leg to stand on for farrowing crates than we do for gestation crates. But I think for those of you that are looking at Prop 12 and you need to do something in farrowing because your metal's worn out or your crates are too small, I think it's naive if you don't think that farrowing is next on the horizon. And so if you're going through all the cost and energy and time to renovate farrowing, why not do something like turnaround crates or some type of more progressive farrowing method that is hopefully going to be compliant for whatever comes next? Try to get ahead of the curve. I'd encourage that, or at least put some thought into making sure you have a footprint that can adapt to that when and if it happens. That being said, it isn't impacting us right now, and there's a lot of dollar signs besides all of this right now because construction costs and labor costs are through the roof. So I also understand why some have chosen not to do that at this point. I've worked with a lot of systems that surprisingly still have some pretty short weaning ages. And they're maybe seeing Prop 12 as a glass half full a little bit as an opportunity for some of those farms to go to a 21, 22, 23-day wean age. On the flip side, I'm working with some farms that are going to Prop 12 that are already a 28-day wean age. I don't think it really makes sense to become a 32-day wean age by going Prop 12. So they're in a completely different landscape where in that situation, I'm already off balance on my gestation numbers. So I would highly recommend increasing gestation space or maybe cannibalizing some farrowing rooms. In the GDU, I already talked that the gilts older than 24 weeks must be at 24 square foot, and most of them today are somewhere in the neighborhood of 12. Can we move the oldest gilts into the new G-barn or the expanded G-barn? That's been a popular option in some design applications where I want to keep the same number of gilts being developed, but I now have these gilts that need to take up twice the footprint that they had before. So I'm going to bring those oldest gilts into the new G-barn or expanded G-barn earlier. Another option that has been considered is if I have finishing nearby, can I convert finishing to a gilt developer and bring in select gilts when they're ready to be bred and when they're ready to be considered at 24 square feet. I think that's one of the applications that's going to be a little bit interesting when we get into compliance on Prop 12, is how our auditors or compliance regulators going to interpret those girls that haven't been bred or designated as for breeding purpose in an off-site finisher until they enter the farm. I think that's one of the gray areas that I'm interested to see. From a feeding system standpoint, I guess there's a lot of different options for you to take in. Those of you that have some group housing experience, this will look familiar. We have floor feeding, we have electronic sow feeders, commonly known as ESFs, shoulder stalls, also known as stanchions, or free access stalls. We also have free access ESFs, which are kind of a combination of a couple of those options. That happens to be the system that I work with regularly, but all of these options are viable strategies depending on the way we try to roll this out. I've always liked this kind of one-page report that PIC put out in 2016 that just kind of examined some of the benefits and weaknesses of each of these different group housing strategies, because all of them have strengths and weaknesses. The pluses are good. So for example, for body condition management, stalls are really good for body condition management. Outdoor housing is really bad for body condition management. From a feed usage standpoint, all the more pressing today with feed costs where they are, shoulder stanchions are not very good for feed use, whereas ESF has historically been very good for feed use because we're feeding sows individually. So I think this is a nice snapshot of some of the pros and cons of different group housing strategies, although not an exhaustive list. One of the most important things for those of you in the audience to be thinking about if you're trying to implement Prop 12 is, when is mixing happening? With Prop 12, we no longer have that stall to breed in and get her through preg check safely before we mix her into the fight. We have to mix them into groups at weaning in some different way, shape, or form, and there's a million different ways to approach that. So it's important to understand some of the physiological background here, is that mixing obviously induces stress, and this can reduce embryo survival depending on when it happens. The two most important physiological reference points are the fact that maternal recognition of pregnancy occurs around the 2nd week of pregnancy. And so we desperately try to avoid a lot of stress or mixing or transport of sows that are greater than 7 days after being bred. The closer to breeding, the better generally, because that also can impact embryo survival or litter size if we have that stress getting closer to that 2nd week of gestation. Beyond that maternal recognition of pregnancy, that's when embryos are starting to implant into the placental wall. There's probably some physiologists here that would argue I'm maybe not describing this perfectly, but for those of us in the audience that are just thinking about a big picture, think of this as implantation. And this is when she's recognizing that she's got embryos and she needs to continue to develop those. We want that to be a safe haven for her and not undergoing a lot of fighting or stress during that time. As a result, most people today, prior to Prop 12, have either been mixing sows right at breeding or waiting until pregnancy check, so at least past 28 days, but most commonly somewhere in the 35-day or beyond time point. Part of the reason for that is when we can successfully ultrasound and confirm pregnancy as well. But generally speaking, avoiding days 7 to 21 like the plague is dogma within the industry. The research on this has been a little bit inconclusive. And one of the things that I think is going to be very interesting for those of us that are dealing with Prop 12 is, what is the impact of multiple mixing events? There hasn't been a whole lot of research done on that, but inevitably, with what we're doing with regard to group housing, we've got girls that get weaned into a group, get bred, not all of them get bred, not all of them get preg checked. How often are we having to remix those groups? I think in general, the goal should be to minimize that as much as possible, but it's not going to be zero either. And so what are the impacts of that, and how important is it that we avoid that? So let's talk about breeding, because we no longer have a traditional G-stall to breed into. One of the first questions I've gotten from a lot of people is, can I breed in pens? Those of you that are quite a bit older than me would remember having done that a lot back in the day. So yes, we can breed in pens. Is it fun? Is it something we can do with our labor constraints? Generally, people don't think about doing that very long until they try to come up with a different plan. So free access stalls, as I have pictured in this image, are one popular option for the breeding event. But there are appropriate levels of caution on free access stalls, because some people that have used them previously and have some length of history with them have some bad stories about maintenance and breakdowns and what that cost is, not to mention the upfront cost of metal right now. So a lot of the questions that people who are writing the checks are asking me is, how many moving parts does that free access stall have? Is it tube or rotted steel? How quickly is it going to rust out? Should I use a 22-inch wide stall for breeding, which might be better for gilts, for example? Or should I use a 24-inch wide stall for breeding? Might be better for sows, but there's some pros and cons. It takes up more space, changes the amount of space I need to have behind the free access stall to meet 24 square feet. I alluded to the long-term maintenance. Probably not too quick to be thinking about that, because 10 years from now, if I put 5,000 of these into a farm, if 5% of those are wearing out each year, that's a lot of maintenance on those stalls and moving parts. Obviously, cost also a factor. But the principle of using a free access stall to breed into is the ability to be able to lock her in temporarily, less than 6 hours per day, detect heat, and breed. And that's part of the reason it's been a very popular option. One of the other options, especially on farms that have good metal, if I've got stalls that I just paid for a couple of years ago, really painful to have to rip out all of them. I need to rip out half of them probably to get to 24 square feet. But if I can keep half and somehow modify the back door of the other half of the stalls and use it for the breeding event, otherwise leaving it open, it's a popular option. And so several different building or equipment manufacturers have been coming up with different strategies to temporarily lock girls in pre-existing G-stalls. And I think in some applications, this accomplishes the same goal as free access stalls. At the same token, how long is that going to last? I mean, how much are we going to learn about those designs as well? I think people have plenty of concerns about free access stalls. I think these Frankenstein options have some challenges too. That being said, I'm definitely an advocate of using something like this or free access stalls for the breeding event, because I still think it's probably our best option today. When we think about the design of these free access or modified stall pens, one of the things we need to think about is, how much space do we need behind those stalls for sows to get in and out, for people to load them, to move them around? But also, if I have 34 sows here, 17 on this side and 17 on this side, if those girls are the ones that I'm breeding on and I'm trying to heat check, how do I run a bore? Do I run two bores? Do I run one bore around this side and then quickly flip them to the other side? Thinking about the slat level logistics of that is something we got to be thinking about as well, is how are we going to accomplish this in a barn with questionable labor situations in a lot of places. Partially slatted. I'll show you a design of a different free access stall pen that is also popular. If I've got partially slatted barns, which a lot of these older barns are, I've usually got a 6 to 10 foot slat somewhere in the middle here. If that slat isn't over the back of those free access stalls, I'm probably going to have a mess as far as pen hygiene. And to be 24 square feet on a 24-inch stall, I need at least 10 foot behind here. So if my slat is something less than 10 foot, it is impossible for me to have that slat positioned in the right spot, or it's right where most sows are going to go to the bathroom. So inevitably, partially slatted makes a double-sided free access stall pen like this nearly impossible, or at least very ugly if it gets done. So double-sided or single-sided free access stall pens are definitely a discussion that I've had in spades. Thinking about how we're going to heat check, how we're going to fill or empty these pens. What about when I run my heat check bore, sows in a neighboring pen locking up before I want them to? Those are some of the different pen design options that we got to think about as we transition to this Prop 12 environment. Also, the fact that if I've got 3 pens right by each other, I can't get access to those pens from the outside walls. I've got to create a hole for my sows to get in and out and get loaded. And that hole probably needs to be big enough for a dead cart. So we probably need to make it at least 4 foot wide, which is wider than it would need to be to just be a feeding space. But those are some of the things that we need to think about, because as soon as you bury a pen like that and expect them all to go in or out the front of the free access stalls, we have a dead in there that we don't have a good way to get to. And people think about that. So I have the same lingo over on this side, but here's an example of a farm that chose to do single-sided free access stall pens because the gray area in this design is slatted. So to keep the back of those sows over slats, it kept stalls right where that row of stalls already pre-existed, make the pen deep enough to be at 24 square feet for every sow, and just make it single-sided. Some appeal to this is being able to run it like a breed snake and run your boar along there and only have one side. So there's certainly some appeal to that. A big question is how deep does this have to be bare minimum? So one popular option when they've gone to this route is if I'm only using the free access stall for a breeding space, could I get by with just a 22-inch wide stall, which then requires a minimum of 6'1" times 22 inches to be at 24 square feet. Most of the free access stall manufacturers would say the more space the better behind, but a bare minimum of 6 foot behind here for sows to back in and get out and get loaded properly. So if they're only going to be in there for a little while, and I can do that, maybe a 22-inch stall with a 6'1" depth behind it works well for a partially slatted environment. One of the biggest things with Prop 12 that we've got to factor in is space utilization. I've already showed you guys how many spaces we're losing in a lot of these barns. When we think about the cost per square foot of building new expansion right now, it's somewhere in the ballpark of $50 plus per square foot due to raw materials costs. So anything I can do to keep sows in the space that I initially put them in is really, really valuable. So one of the things that I have been a huge advocate for is some type of hospital space within the pen that I put those girls in. I don't really care whether it's a pen like this or hospital crates, which if they truly need to be hospitalized are allowed as part of the exemption for Prop 12. But you're naive if you don't think you're going to have 2 to 4% of your sows fall out due to lameness, illness, body condition issues. Have somewhere to put them. It's one of the big mistakes I've seen in a lot of group housing barns from a decade or longer ago is no plan on hospital sows. And then we complain about sow death loss, but I routinely have seen barns where we converted a finisher to group housing, and the plan for hospital sows is to move those girls in a bus or move them across an alley to go back to the stall barn if they need hospitalized. Those of you that have spent a lot of time in a hog barn, if you make it hard for workers to get a hospitalized girl hospitalized, it's not going to happen. We're going to treat her in the pen, maybe, hope she gets better. If she doesn't, she gets destroyed. So having a plan for group housing hospitalization is critical, regardless of what type of group housing you do. These are 2 popular options that allow me to keep that girl in the same footprint I already gave to her. I don't have a problem with a dedicated hospital pen nearby, but every time I take her out to a dedicated hospital pen or stall, she's now taking up 2 spots in my barn. And when I've already lost a ton of spots going to 24 square feet, anything I can do creatively like this is good. And the fact that it's right there in the pen she's already in makes it very hard for a laborer to make an excuse that they couldn't get that done on Friday afternoon. So I think this is a big takeaway for you guys at any group housing approach. So I thought I'd give you a big picture example. This is a nice, clean, easy one. 5,000 sow farm that we weren't adding on, but we're renovating. All the gestations under one nice roof, so it was a little easier and cleaner. In this approach, which is going on right now, we have enough free access stall pens for around 7 days of weaned sows, plus enough space for our opportunities, some heat no service, some sow movements, to be able to have enough flex in that breeding area to get those girls bred, yet move them into pens right away because we want to avoid remixing not very long after breeding, right? We want to get them into pens and get them cooled down and their hierarchy established as soon as possible after breeding. But we need to remember in these free access stall pens, they're still in a pen. They still have the ability to form a dominance hierarchy. So one of the strategies that I've tried to employ is have a manageable number of free access stalls. I think these are around 34 head, and have it try to make sense, although it'll never be perfect, to where if I have to move those girls into their next home, maybe something like 2 free access stall pens could plop down in one next pen environment. That's going to vary a lot by farm and by pig flow, but in this farm, that's what we tried to implement is we have about 68 sows in 2 free access stall pens. We have a home for 63 of them at 24 square feet. Somewhere in that neighborhood, we're going to be pretty close because we know we're not going to get all 100% of them bred within 7 days. You can see the application of within pen hospital pens. We've got a free access ESF in this environment. But the part that I want you guys to focus on is thinking big picture on layout. This is where the sows are going to land from breeding until preg check. So this is going to be the core area after breeding where most of the labor is going to be needed. This is where aggression is going to be at. This is where any girls that maybe haven't learned how to use the feed system is going to be at. This is where I'm going to need to run my heat check bore for my recycles. So keeping that as close as possible to my office, which is actually located right here, and breeding makes sense, right? There happened to be an alley here that was pre-existing going across to farrowing. So it naturally fit in this barn to have post-preg check, have those sows graduate to slightly smaller pens, figuring approximately 10% conception rate loss of preg check sows that can get by with maybe one less feed station, and we can save quite a bit in footprint. Okay? Some might argue, I don't want to move them again. Well, we need to think about how far we have to take those heat check bores, those people have to go to follow those sows through the snake, and do the math on 40 pens times 168 square foot if I was to have these set up for 63, times somewhere upwards of $50 per sow space. We're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of $250,000 on this barn if I didn't want to move those girls again. So if I can do that, and I can make it a critical control point to help make sure that my managers can keep my slat level people successful, I think it's worthy of having this move post-preg check. Because in some of my experience with pre-implantation mixing, which is what I'm generally referring to this as, that's one of the biggest mistakes I've seen is when I have labor issues or I have execution issues, I have a lot of not in pig sows that stay in those pens way longer than they need to, and you don't find them until they get to farrowing. Creates a huge drag on your non-productive days, and open sows in pens create more open sows for those of you that have that experience. So anything I can do to have a critical control point to make sure that nobody's landing down here that isn't confirmed pregnant, to me is a worthy step. The other part of this too from a labor standpoint is these are established pens. These sows are already grouped together. We aren't reintroducing or remixing any animals, and we've got very little problems post-preg check. So we can focus the labor on the early gestation problems. Let's talk about slat level personnel a little bit because I can't overstate the importance of the adjustment that needs to happen. Going from 100% stalls to Prop 12 is a big jump. Going from 100% stalls to post-preg check group housing is a relatively big jump, but if we're really trying to go to all pens in one move, you need to prepare your people and have your expectations set a little low or be very well prepared for that because that's a big shift, not just for the sows, but I would say even more so for the people. Think about pen size. You know, if I have to go find a sow in a pen, do I really want to be hunting for her in a really big pen? But simultaneously, I also have to factor in how much it costs for the extra metal and the grouping events. So finding that balance, depending on your sow farm size, is a really important conversation. I try to match that up, if possible, to approximately how many I breed per week or per day, and how many I'm moving to farrowing per day or per week. And if I can make that match with pen size, I'm hopefully going to make that easier for the slat level workers. I bolded and underlined the fact that sow grouping events must be minimized. I think that has got to be one of your main takeaways if you're writing anything down today. We've got to minimize reintroducing sows at different time points in their production cycle. If I go back to this example, I went from 2 pens being a group of 68 to a pen being a group of 63 to a pen being a group of 56. I know that the girls that come out of those pens because they're open or otherwise have to get worked back into the system or get culled, but I'm keeping the integrity of those groups intact as they go through that process. That's critical. It's never going to be perfect, but the more we can do that, the better, and the peer-reviewed literature would back that up. So body condition management is also an important factor for us. Body condition management, we got to think about the fact that we no longer have that stall to get her in the right body condition after weaning. A lot of people that do group housing today post-preg check would use the 42 days or 35 days they have in a stall to try to get those sows in a right body condition before they move to pens. This is especially important if you have some type of competitive feeding environment like stanchions or floor feeding. With ESF, at least you can control that on an individual sow basis. But now that we're mixing them at breeding, we're putting one of the hands behind our back, is we don't have that ability to rely on her being in the same stall every day because she's in a pen and she can go wherever she wants. So we've got to think about that, is how much is this going to impact body condition variation and reproduction and performance when we have first trimester sows varying heavily in body condition. I think this needs to be a factor when you're trying to make group housing decisions on what system you're using. One thing that I've heard from some people is I'm not going to be able to do overbreeding anymore. So if I have a short breed week, the next week I might usually have overbred to try to make up for that week I was short. But now I've got these pens that are sized for each week and sized for 24 square feet. I can't just overbreed that next week because I may not have a good spot to put them unless I'm remixing again. So the other piece of this too is on the next slide, or one of the slides coming up, I'm optimistic about what I'm seeing from my early Prop 12 barns as far as performance. But I will say too that I think we got to keep in mind that there's a lot more sow movement, there's a lot more stockmanship that goes into some of these things that I'm talking about with Prop 12. We've got to think about the labor realities of how many sows per person we can really handle in these barns. I'm going to keep moving, so we got plenty of time for questions. But we need to realize that over-conditioned sows are very costly. And this is what I see as a struggle in a lot of pen housing environments today, post-preg check, is we get too many sows that are over-conditioned going into farrowing. I don't think Prop 12 is going to make that better unless we really strategically attack how we do it. And the cost of increased back fat at farrowing has some reproductive benefits, not to mention those who are pushing a pencil to feed costs if we have to use an extra half a pound of feed per sow in order to keep them comfortable with each other. Body condition scoring is going to be critical. It already is critical, but trying to do that at breeding, at preg check, somewhere in late gestation is going to be more and more important. Hopefully you have some management tools at your fingertips to A, get them scored properly, but also to adjust those on an individual sow basis. Many electronic sow feeding systems have this opportunity to have them automatically change at a certain time point if you'd like. From a slat level standpoint, the key is identifying the right person to manage group gestation. And when we go to Prop 12, we now have 16 weeks of pen gestation instead of 10. That's going to become even more important. There are some people that are from a stall background, they don't adapt well to pen gestation. Maybe it's time to move them into farrowing, move them into gilt development, but they just may not be a good fit to be successful in pen gestation. In most retrofits, previously stall house sows are going to have to go group housing. And a lot of times, some sows land in pens that probably shouldn't have. I would recommend, although it rarely gets done, trying to find those girls who are unlikely to be successful early and maybe get them into a hospital pen before you ever throw them in the big group pen and let them get their butt kicked, because they're just going to get pulled out of there eventually anyways. If we can use a mixing pen as we're going through this process to give them extra square footage, but the first rotation of those girls going from stalls to pens is the hardest. It gets a lot better afterwards, and I'm confident that we're going to figure this out, and we have in many cases already. But having that additional labor available is really critical. I was at a farm last week that was converting sows to pens, and we unfortunately, due to timing, had to mix those sows into pens on Thursday. When are we going to start finding those girls that aren't eating? Saturday and Sunday. Not the best time to be mixing sows on a Thursday because we have a bunch of girls that are off feed for 2 or 3 days when we know we're shorthanded. So trying to do those events on a Monday, Tuesday, if possible, makes a heck of a lot more sense. Quickly talking about enforcement and compliance. I think this is a really interesting area that's going to be learned next year especially. Who is going to do the auditing? Third-party independent certifiers. That's pretty clear based on the legal text within the California regulations. How are they going to do it? They need to be done on-site at least once every 12 months. And there's a nice note in the newly released text that says that unannounced audits are allowed. I'm sure that would maybe rankle some feathers on some people. The penalty for not complying for Prop 12 is a criminal offense, which is very important from a legal standpoint. And we need to keep the records of our certification on site for at least 2 years. I'm very interested to see how the gray areas of Prop 12 get implemented, because I'm being asked to design barns that are going to be compliant. And there are some gray areas that I think would majorly change how I approach some designs. But some of those that immediately pop up is, how will biological variation be interpreted? I've got a pen that's designed for 56 sows because I bred 62. What about when I have a great breed week and 95% of them stay pregnant? Is it better animal welfare to take those 3 sows and mix them with another pen that was on a short breed week? Or would it be better to maybe overstock that pen at 58 sows instead of 56? I would argue it's better animal welfare to keep them intact, but technically that's not 24 square feet. What constitutes individual treatment? This has been a big question for a lot of people, is how many G stalls can I keep for individual treatment? I'd argue 2 to 4% is justifiable because that's the number of removals I typically see in a lot of pen housing, but that's going to be something at an auditing level that's probably going to be up to the auditor. When are gilts determined for breeding purposes? Also a good question that I get asked a lot too is, can I develop these gilts off-site, and if they're 24 weeks of age but they haven't been determined to select gilt, when do they have to be at 24 square feet? Very valid question. I'm sure there are other questions you guys have thought of that I maybe have and haven't listed here, but there's going to be some gray areas that'll be interesting in 2022 and beyond. 2022 is going to be a learning year. That being said, the early Prop 12 conversions that I've been a part of that are already operating at a high level have, surprisingly, in my opinion, shown very good reproductive performance. I'm seeing farrowing rates of 88 to 92%, conception rates well above 90%, and I think that's a really good thing. That's a silver lining, in my opinion. I think a lot of economists and a lot of us that are being negative have talked about 3 to 5% loss of farrowing rate. Initially, I think that may have been overstated, and I hope it has been overstated. However, I think because of all the aforementioned problems, this is going to introduce more variation between farms. Those farms that have good staff and have the right number of staff and less turnover are probably going to ride this out better than those who don't. Sow death loss, we do have sows in pens a lot longer, and we have seen group housing cause an uptick in sow death loss, among other things. Maybe Dr. Ross could talk about that a little more, but I'm concerned about what this will do with sow death loss. I would struggle to think it's going to make it go down. I think another important takeaway for you guys is, regardless of the results of the Prop 12 legal action, I've already showed you that I know of at least 250,000 sows that are going Prop 12 right now. Do we think that those are just going to disappear if the legal action is successful and is overturned? I feel like this is a snowball that's kind of already started rolling on us. And I think you're naive if you don't think that the future of the U.S. sow industry involves more pens and less stalls. And I've seen a lot of people who maybe are 100% stalls today, not necessarily going California Prop 12, but all of a sudden moving them after preg check to pens looks pretty palatable. And so starting down that path and at least getting your teams comfortable with group housing is more important than ever. What's next? I already talked about turnaround farrowing crates, but we look to Europe or look to other countries as to what's coming down the pike. I think turnaround farrowing crates is on our horizon. Physical castration without anesthesia is on our horizon. Germany is passing legislation to remove crates altogether. One of the reasons for that is they abused free access stalls and closed them all the time, and now the legal action that's being taken is they're going to be taken away altogether. So how long until we have that on our doorstep? And does that play into the fact of how many free access stalls do we keep in our barns? That being said, to end on a positive note, I've kind of been stuck in the middle here in the doom and gloom with New Fashioned Pork. Dr. Ross is hopefully going to be a little more optimistic here on his session. I think it's good for us to remember that 40 years ago, we had a lot of sows housed outdoors. And we've made it through that. The sow adapted, the people adapted. We're going to do that here too. And there are lots of other places in the world that are already operating at similar management techniques as this. We're going to get through it, but the transition is really important to do it the right way. So I'm confident we're going to get through it, and I hope I can help you guys with that process, and I hope my perspective has been valuable for you guys today. I'm sure that I'm tight on time, but I would love to entertain a few questions if we have time.
Yeah, 1 or 2.
Hey, Hyatt.
Yeah.
Since the industry seems to be moving towards Prop 12 a little quicker than we probably anticipated, do you think that is going to perpetuate a much faster transition in other states as well to go Prop 12, or therefore encourage those who might have an oversupply of Prop 12 pork to push for that as well, so that way they can regain their investment? How does ROI factor into all of this, given that more people are moving into this than we probably anticipated?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the factors that you've got to, so the question is about ROI for conversion to Prop 12 in other states or legislation for other states. One of the things that I did not spend much time on today, but is extremely important, is if I'm a packer, I've got to think about moving pork to the West Coast. I oftentimes am not necessarily only moving it into the confines of California. Vegas, or Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, Washington. How much easier is it going to be for a distributor or a pork supplier to just make sure that all the pork that goes that direction is Prop 12 compliant, because it's a lot easier than segregating product. You know, mandatory country of origin labeling has been a big topic for us for a long time, but one of the reasons that's been so painful to try to implement is because segregation of product at the packing and distribution level is very painful and very costly. So all of a sudden, making us on the south side become Prop 12 compliant is a lot less costly than some of that pain. So rolling out Prop 12 on a broader scale, again, I think this is part of the reason that snowball has started headed down that direction, because the ROI, when you factor it in from farm to fork, it seems really expensive on the front side for us in the sow barn, but when we break that out to a pound of pork, it's not as expensive as some of the other negative consequences of trying to segregate that product for California. Think about auto emissions as a good example. You know, we've adapted auto emissions based on California regulations because it was easier for auto manufacturers to just apply that wholesale rather than just make a segregated product for California. I got a question here first, sorry.
Sow aggression during estrus cycle, so post-wean till you're out of estrus. How has that gone on farms that are already, I mean, are they sitting in the free access stalls pretty much 24/7, or what's their behavior like?
Yeah, so questions about aggression of sows right around the time of breeding, time of estrus. Yes, sows are also aggressive right at weaning. I would argue at weaning they may be more aggressive based on the data I've come across than post-preg check. Right after breeding, especially if you're using free access or such, they have the ability to hide in those free access stalls. Depending on the age of the animals and the dynamic of that pen, you know, if we have old sows with young gilts, I see gilts use the space behind the free access stalls more than sows. Sows will, they know they got a boss that might be picking on them, that they'll go in and hide. Generally speaking, I think having 24 square feet gives you some leeway, but I think the level of aggression is similar. So that's why we need to make sure that doing it at a physiologically less important time is a good strategy, rather than waiting until 14 days bred. Last question?
Last one.
Yeah, Dr. Frecking?
California has a statute that's been on the books since 2013 and was implemented in 2019, requiring a turnaround provision. So to be compliant as January 1st, 2022, those pigs had to be compliant as of May 1st. There's a significant misconception in our industry that they're saying, if I get compliant December 31st, I'm fine. That is wrong. Those pigs had to be born May 1st to be compliant.
It's a great point. For those of you that couldn't hear Dr. Frecking, the compliance is predicated upon a turnaround clause that was set for May of this year. So being compliant by the end of this year might be interpreted as not compliant by those who are trying to integrate that into the pork stream next year. I think that's some of where I put the 2022 is going to be a learning year. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how compliance and certification gets regulated in the short term, because it's going to be a little bit of the Wild West next year, I think, of all these farms that are trying to become compliant, not having the certification infrastructure in place, and the interpretation from the state of California.
The other main point is your criminal offenses at civil. So if you're not compliant May 1st, whatever you do, don't sign an affidavit saying you're out. Because if you get back to the packer, he is a meeting. The packer gives it to Pasco, they're the individual that signed it, prepares the civil or criminal penalty.
Thank you, Dr. Frecking.
Yeah, so let's thank Dr. Frobos.